So, as we all know, or should know, the diversity in tech conversation is nothing new, but it has evolved in the last year or so. Erica, can you tell me how that conversation has evolved?
Previously, people didn't really talk about diversity in tech much at all. If anything, they would speak about how we need more women in tech, maybe. And now people are starting to look at all aspects of diversity in tech, from the gender problems, the race problems, exclusion of people with disabilities, exclusion of people who aren't young.
Right.
So the conversation has gotten a lot more multifaceted.
Before we came on stage, you mentioned that you weren't the biggest fan of the title of this panel.
Oh, right. So what is it? Fixing the culture?
Fixing tech's
Fixing tech's
problem.
culture problem. I don't think tech has so much of a culture problem. I think it has an exclusion problem. The default is to exclude people who don't match the patterns that people expect. So I think once we fix the exclusion problems and focus on some of the issues that underlie that, racism, sexism, I think we can make a lot more progress than just looking at it as like a culture problem.
Right.
Yeah.
Danielle, speaking of exclusion, so at Intel, it's 3.5% African American. In 2014, by end of that year, it was 3.4%. So there has not been much of an improvement. Why aren't we seeing much growth there?
Yeah. So what I would say that we've learned on our own journey is that this has to be a long-term commitment that tech companies make. This is not overnight change. It's difficult to move numbers, especially at a company like Intel that's 107,000 people. You have to be in it for the long haul. I do think you've got to set aggressive goals, which we've certainly had some success with in setting goals around hiring and retention. But you do have to really be committed to driving the change over time. And it never happens fast enough for our liking. I will readily admit that.
Right. And what's retention like at Intel?
So for about the past decade, actually, we saw our diverse employees leaving at greater numbers than their non-diverse counterparts. So our underrepresented minorities and our women were leaving Intel at greater numbers. Last year, we were able to stop that trend and even out our retention rates, where women and underrepresented minorities were leaving at comparable rates to their non-diverse counterparts.
So what changed there? Why are women and underrepresented minorities not leaving at as high of a rate?
Yeah, I think we've really tried to invest in making diversity and inclusion a very significant initiative that's led from the top down. You know, our CEO, Brian Krzanich, made some pretty big, bold announcements about the importance of diversity and inclusion in our workforce. We set measurable goals. We tied every employee's pay to achieving those goals. And we started releasing our data. And I think our diverse employees hopefully sort of realized that, hey, this was more than lip service. This was something that we really cared about. And again, we were committed to for the long haul. We've invested a ton this year in manager training, in culture training for all our employees. And I think it's starting to move the needle, Megan. We're still not where we want to be, but we're on the right track.
You said that you tie employees' pay to diversity numbers. Everyone?
Everyone in the company, yeah. So we have a company-wide bonus program.
Okay.
Every year we set a number of corporate goals. For the past 2 years, we've had a goal around diverse hiring and diverse retention, and every single employee at Intel gets paid if we hit those numbers. Really powerful way, I think, to say that you're serious and you're committed.
Yeah. Carissa, you do a lot of work through Paradigm at companies like Slack, Airbnb, Pinterest. Based on your experience with those companies, what advice do you have for Intel, this huge company that's trying to tackle diversity and inclusion?
Yeah, well, I think one thing that Intel is doing really well is really taking a data-driven approach to understanding and addressing barriers to diversity and inclusion. And that's really the way that we work with our clients, right? I think the way that kind of diversity and inclusion initiatives have traditionally been approached is by noticing that there's a problem, looking around and seeing like what are other companies doing and kind of relying on so-called best practices that aren't really based on research. And what we work with companies to do is look at your data, see where your unique barriers are, and then based on research, design strategies to address those particular barriers, and don't wait like 1 to 2 years to see if the numbers change. Look at those proximal outcomes so you can understand if what you're doing is working sooner.
Got it. What are some of the most glaring culture problems you've seen in your work?
Yeah, something that I've been thinking about a lot is kind of this culture of genius or culture of brilliance that we have in tech. So really similar to something that I studied in graduate school called kind of fixed mindset or growth mindset. It's a lot of research showing that kind of people's beliefs about the nature of talents and abilities, whether they're fixed, kind of like eye color, which is referred to as a fixed mindset, or whether you believe that abilities and talents can be developed, so more of a growth mindset. When individuals have these beliefs, individuals who have a fixed mindset tend to focus more on improving themselves. They think that effort and struggle means that they lack talent, and they tend to give up more easily, whereas individuals with a growth mindset are more interested in improving, and they remain resilient in the face of challenge. It turns out that companies and even whole fields can have these mindsets too. And when companies or fields have this more fixed mindset view, when there's this culture of brilliance, people that don't kind of fit our stereotype about who is brilliant in our society are not only less attracted to those companies and those fields, but once they're there, there's kind of more pressure to feel like you have to prove yourself. Whereas a growth mindset culture rejects this idea of fixed abilities, and so stereotypes, which are about groups' fixed abilities, kind of carry less weight.
Right, so how do we get rid of these stereotypes? Is there a solution?
Yeah, so in terms of growth and fixed mindsets, there are a lot of things that companies can do to foster more of a growth mindset, and I know this is something that Intel is working on. So the way that you give feedback to employees, right? Are you focusing on kind of innate traits? Are you saying, you're so talented at X, or are you helping people kind of focus on the process, understand how, what they did, the effort that they put in, the strategies they use, how is that tied to success? Or openly talking about mistakes and making it okay to take a risk, even if that doesn't necessarily lead to success. Those are the things that we know from the research can help develop more of this growth mindset culture.
Awesome.
Erica, what are some of the culture problems you've seen at Slack around diversity and inclusion?
Well, Slack's a fast-growing company, and we hire a lot from other companies in tech. And people come with their biases that they formed at those other companies, and so it's a challenge to try to get them to think in ways that are different. But I feel like we're doing a pretty decent job of that. I think that it's important for us to continue talking about how diversity matters to Slack, to continue working on inclusivity. And I feel like if we keep doing that, we'll have a pretty decent culture. I think it's very important that we're starting now while we're still a small startup.
Right.
I've said frequently that it's hard to turn a tanker, right? So, a big 100,000 person company like Intel, a big 50,000 or more person company like Google, it's hard to change the culture in those companies. But if you start small, if you start at the startup stage when there's 25, 100, 500 people, it's easier to bake in diversity and inclusion at that point, so that when your company grows, your culture is already where it needs to be.
Right. Danielle, of course, Intel is huge, and you've been in your role for a little less than a year now. Do you wish Intel had brought you on 10 years ago?
Yeah, I talk to a lot of my peers at startups, and one thing I talk about a lot is when you're small, now is the time to set those aggressive, bold goals.
Yeah.
Now's the time to start examining your data and really go about building your culture very deliberately. Because at Intel, we've had 40 years of decisions and culture building, and it is very hard to drive change when you've had that very long sort of tradition rooted. So I think for startups, the time is really now to seize the opportunity and do things differently. I think there's so much opportunity small companies have to really get this right.
Right. Erica, you recently launched Project Include, so you teamed up with women in tech, such as Ellen Pao, Frida Kapor Klein, just kind of this dream team of diversity in tech. And so with Project Include, the idea is to provide concrete recommendations for startup founders and for VCs in tech. What has the feedback been like from the startup and VC community?
We've gotten really great feedback from the startup and VC community. The last I checked, we were at, I want to say 800 signups on our interest page.
Okay.
That was a few days ago. I hadn't had a chance to look at it recently.
And what does that interest say to you? 800 people saying, hey, we want to learn more about what you're doing? Or?
Definitely. There are a large portion of those who are partners at VCs who want to sign up for our VC Include program, and CEOs at startups. I know there's one startup I won't name particularly, but like 5 people from their company signed up on the page, and they reached out to Tracy and reached out to everybody they knew at Project Include to try to get involved. So
meaning that company has a serious problem.
Or they really want to make sure they get things right. They may not have a problem, but they really care about making sure they do things right. And I feel like we're going to continue to see that sort of positive feedback. Yeah,
and so Project Include is a bit of a side project for you.
Right.
You mentioned backstage that Tracy Chow at Pinterest, they actually gave her time to work on it.
Right.
But at Slack, that time was not offered to you, even though about 20% of your job is supposed to be around diversity and inclusion at Slack.
So I don't know that that they wouldn't have given me the time. I didn't ask for it, so maybe I should have asked for it. But Tracy did get the time from Pinterest to work on it, and I was happy to work on it in my free time after work, just because I think it's that important. Like, it is very important for us to change the industry and change the biases in the industry right now, because we're having this boom of startups right now, and to make sure that those companies are diverse and inclusive, when they grow to be the big companies, the Facebooks, the Googles, their cultures will set the tone for the next wave. So it's important to set it in and bake it in now.
Right. So last thing on Project Include.
Okay.
I think we'll see what happens.
All right. Up for it.
So it's a pretty hefty resource. I admittedly have not gotten through all of it, and I am someone. I know, but just being honest, and I am someone who really cares about diversity and inclusion in the industry. So how do you get people who may not be as passionate about diversity and inclusion to really look into all of the resources on Project Include?
How do we get them to look at the pages?
Yeah.
Well, so we've broken it up. Not everything is going to be applicable to everybody at once, and so we've broken it up into different sections. So people can go and look at what they care about at that moment, and I would hope that they look at the whole thing. But if there's something they really want to focus on, we have different sections for them. And also there are little guidelines on the pages that say this applies to companies when they're at 25 or more employees, right? And so if you're a 7-person startup, maybe you don't need to worry about that.
Right.
So we realized that it's a pretty hefty piece of work, and so we tried to make it easier for people to get into it.
Right.
Yeah.
Are you tracking what people, or which parts of Project Include people are looking at?
I'm sure we have analytics happening somewhere, but I'm not looking at the analytics. But I'm fairly certain we had a long discussion about that. So yeah.
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 Got it. Danielle, you mentioned that it's really never too early to start working on diversity. What advice do you have for the startups in the audience right now?
Sure. I think the big thing that we've learned on our journey is start with the data, right? I think we are, by and large, an engineering culture, and what works is measuring where you are, setting concrete goals, and really being very clear about those goals and how you intend to report on them. What we're finding is, again, using the data, we're understanding what the real issues are. We're now reporting our data twice a year, which again helps keep us accountable.
Right.
And setting those real goals and holding all employees accountable for them, I think is what truly moves the needle. So I always tell people, don't be afraid of the data. It probably isn't going to be where you want it to. Ours certainly isn't. But if you don't know what you're dealing with, it's really hard to drive change.
Totally.
Right.
Yeah.
And so you and Intel CEO Brian Krzanich have been working to drive change in the area of diversity and inclusion at the company. Brian said at Reverend Jesse Jackson's Push Tech 2020 conference that there's actually been some backlash inside of the company. Could you tell me a bit more about that?
Yeah, certainly. So I think anytime you embark on culture change of this magnitude, and let me be clear, diversity and inclusion is big culture change for the tech industry. That's okay. I don't think you should be scared of that. I don't think that should turn you off. But it's big culture change. And I think anytime you embark on that, you've got people that wholeheartedly embrace it and that are really excited about it. And by the way, I think that's the majority for Intel. We've had so many employees tell us how much they appreciate and are energized by our commitment. But at the same time, you've got a lot of people that this is challenging to that status quo. It's threatening, and people worry about what it means for them. I think that's human nature. So we've got this continuum of where people are at on their journey. And again, I think our job is to bring the conversation forward, bring them to the other end of the continuum, and say that, hey, true inclusion means you include everybody. It's not about excluding the majority in favor of the minority. It's creating a place where everybody's heard and everybody's valued. And that change doesn't happen overnight, but it is worth it.
Brian Krzanich also mentioned that it might have something to do with white men feeling threatened. Do you agree? Do you think that has something to do with it?
You know, one thing I do think, Megan, is we haven't done a good enough job sort of bringing our white and Asian male population into the conversation. Okay. I don't think you can do diversity without engaging that majority population. And what I oftentimes find is these people want to be part of the conversation, but it's sort of fraught with landmines, and they're not really sure how to go about engaging. Mm-hmm. And I think we could do a better job of engaging our peers in the dialogue, talking a little bit about the issues like white privilege and things that are just sort of hard to talk about, and creating a safe space where you can get the real issues out instead of sort of keeping them just under the surface. I think that's the next step we really need to take as an industry.
Definitely. Erica.
Oh yeah, I found that the key to bringing people into the conversation is making it okay for them to be uncomfortable, right? Saying up front, like, this is going to be an uncomfortable conversation. That's okay. We're all going to have some discomfort around this. Own it.
Yeah.
And then you can move forward with the conversation.
I think what you're saying about bringing people in to be a part of the solution is really important, and that's consistent with what we see in research. In a large meta-analysis looking at what makes diversity policies work, one of the main moderators that the research finds is that when managers feel like they're a part of the solution, not just a part of the problem, that's going to be more likely to make whatever kinds of changes you're doing more successful.
Right,
definitely. So that brings me to what are the costs of implementing these diversity policies, either financially or culturally? And we've kind of touched on culturally, but yeah.
So I think that it takes time, right? One thing that, and I think we have to be honest about that, right? This is not something that happens overnight. This is something that you need multiple people to be involved in. Sometimes it will take longer to bring people in that are different because those people aren't traditionally exposed to this industry, and so you need to be honest about that's going to take longer and communicate the value of that to people, so people understand this is worth our investment. This is worth taking more time to make this happen.
It's definitely going to take a lot more time, and it's going to take some different sort of training, right? Like, you can't continue to do the same things over and over again that you've been doing and expect a different result. So, the time it's going to take is going to be, much more, and it's going to take a lot more, training about how to reach different audiences, different groups. I feel like in tech, a lot of companies are used to the influx of people coming to them, especially for hiring. It's like, oh, we don't have to worry about going out to find people, but it's a different way of thinking to go find the people who aren't coming to you in mass.
I do think you've got to treat this as an investment, just like any other investment you do in your business. I mean, certainly Intel announced that we were investing $300 million in solving this challenge by the year 2020. That's big money, right? But I think it's also because we're attacking the problem really holistically, looking at our supply chain, our hiring practices, our culture, our retention, the way we train, the way we invest in things like suppliers and startups. It isn't cheap, but big, important issues are rarely inexpensive to tackle. And I really think, again, you have to attack the problem holistically and with a lot of solutions, not just money, not just training, a lot of things.
Right. And to be clear, so Intel recently announced some layoffs. Do those layoffs have any effect on Intel's diversity and inclusion efforts?
Yeah. So no, they don't. Again, I think our commitment to diversity and inclusion is because we truly believe it's key to Intel's evolution as a company. And that's something we continue to be committed to. Our 2020 goals have absolutely not changed, even in the face of, some of the business imperatives we're undertaking right now. It's still important, and we've got to be committed to it over the long term.
Right. So all three of you had a previous relationship with each other, right? Or you knew who the others were. I'm wondering. So for companies that don't have maybe the resources to hire a head of diversity and inclusion, or hire a consulting company like Paradigm, or have someone like you who's just willing to step away from engineering from time to time to work on this issue, what can startups do right now, or what are the solutions for them?
Project Include. I mean, that's what we created it for, right? We know that companies don't have the money to spend on consulting, or can't afford to bring on a head of diversity and inclusion right now, because they have to hire more engineers to actually build their product. So we created Project Include is to give them this sort of roadmap, this guidebook, these recommendations, so they don't have to worry about spending money, but they don't have an excuse not to do it.
Right.
Yeah.
I think there's a lot of value in kind of having a place where all of the research is synthesized for people, so that people aren't relying just on best practices, but are learning about what works and kind of how to design the culture right from the beginning. So I'm really excited about the work that you guys are doing.
Right.
Thank you.
I would say two things. I think the first thing is reach out. So whenever I'm asked to speak to another company about diversity, however big, however small, I always make the time to do it, because I believe if there's one thing that I'm doing that might help another company, there are no secrets. It elevates the experience for everybody in the industry. I think the second part, and you certainly don't need a chief diversity and inclusion officer to do this, is gather the data, right? See where you're at today. Look at what the data tells you, and maybe set one or two goals that you're going to take on this year that move the needle in some meaningful way.
Yeah, speaking of the data, so in tech company diversity reports, we rarely see stats on LGBTQ status, disability status, things like that. I know Slack actually did include LGBTQ status, but why isn't that common? Why aren't we seeing that very much?
I think one reason is that companies don't collect that data, and so we need to do a better job at asking people to self-identify, because if we're not measuring these things, it's going to be really hard to track what is the experience like for people from these different groups.
Right. And also, I think companies might be scared to track certain data. To ask somebody what if they're LGBTQ. That seems a little scary, like traditional HR. Manuals or whatever, so you don't talk to your employees about that, right? So it's a tricky place, but I think we can grow there for sure.
Yeah. Are there any other stats that you think are missing from these diversity reports?
Oh, definitely. We don't see retention data. So the stats that we see are like percentages of employees, right? But we don't see retention. We don't see, how many harassment cases got settled out of court. We don't see how many people are taking the parental leave that's offered. There's a lot of data that just isn't in those reports that could really speak to what the culture is like at a company.
Right.
Yeah.
I do think, though, you're starting to see companies on that data continuum. Last year we started showing our retention data We started
Awesome.
showing our pay data.
Yeah.
The next thing I think we're going to start looking at is, again, our LGBTQ, diverse abilities, and veterans data. I think you've got to start somewhere, and sometimes you get in that analysis paralysis, right, of, oh, if I don't show everything, I'm not doing anything.
Yeah.
Everybody's got to start somewhere, and I think for better or for worse, people have started with especially women and then broadened that to sort of looking at underrepresented minorities. I think where the future's headed is showing data about everything. I think you've got to sort of realize that, hey, showing your data can be a good thing, it's nothing to be afraid of, and then the floodgates open.
Yeah. Last thing, and we kind of touched on this earlier, but institutionalized racism and discrimination, those are hard topics to discuss for some people.
Right.
How can we get everyone in this room feeling comfortable about talking about it?
I mean, it's tricky. It's an uncomfortable conversation for many people, right? Like, it's hard for people even outside of the tech industry to talk about institutionalized racism. But I feel like it's very important. I think that people in tech tend to look at themselves as like being isolated from the rest of society, right? Like, oh, we're in this bubble of tech, we're different from everybody else. But the reality is, you know, people come from everywhere, and there's institutionalized racism and sexism and bias against, you know, people of all different sorts. And once we come to, you know, terms with the fact that we aren't different from the rest of society and that we have to work on and address these issues also, we'll make some good progress.
All right.
Yeah.
That's all the time we have. Thank you so much. Let's give them a round of applause.
Thanks, Megan.